Hi, my name is Max Gagliardi. I'm the co-founder of Ancova Energy and also the host of the Talk Energy podcast.
Hi, Wildcatters. I'm Josh Adler. I'm the founding CEO of Sourcewater, Inc. in Houston, Texas.
Josh, welcome to the Evolve Conference. Excited to interview you for this.
Thanks, Max. It's great to be here. If here still just means I'm sitting in my house.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Digital conference. It's the new way, but it's fun. Look, we've got a camera, we've got a program. We can do this right here, and I'm excited about it. I'm glad that I got to do your segment. You've got a really interesting company. I love anything that's tech related in oil and gas, and so for people that don't know about Sourcewater, I thought a good way to start this thing would be to just talk about maybe the evolution of the company. I think you guys started out as more of a water marketplace, kind of originally, but now you're doing a lot of interesting things on the satellite and imagery front. So maybe just give a little bit of background. The company.
Sure. Thanks, Max. I started the company back in early 2014. I'd been a fellow at MIT in a program called Energy Ventures, and I was really excited about the shale revolution 1.0 going on in the United States. It just seemed to me, there's this huge industrial growth phenomenon that looked kind of like the internet in the 90s or PCs in the 80s. And I just kind of wanted to figure out how I could get in on that. And so it seemed to me that whatever was new about unconventional energy versus conventional energy would be where the opportunity was to solve new problems and where there'd probably be a lot of things that people hadn't figured out yet. Or as I kind of like to say, anything gets that big that fast, there's no way they know what they're doing. So I started focusing on water as that seemed like really something big and new, because for the first time, water was the biggest thing going in or out of the upstream supply chain. And that was completely new in this time period of the early shale revolution. And so I just started learning everything I could about that. And I kind of had this eureka moment. Might have been the wrong eureka moment, but I remember sitting in this coffee shop getting an explanation from a gal who was doing kind of optimization of water movements on well sites in the Marcellus. And I was like, well, wait a minute. How do they know where to get the water from, though? Like you're telling me where to move it, they're going to move it around and all this, but like where they buy that water? Where they get that water? Where's that water go at the end when they need to get rid of it? And, she was kind of like, oh, I don't know. I never really thought about that. I thought, oh, they need a marketplace.
I've heard some people describe the E&P business as just moving water around. I know a guy that's very into this, in the water side of the space. He goes, really, all we're doing is just moving water. That's the core of the business. Yeah,
it's about 9 parts, 10 parts water, for even more than that. Actually, if you take into account the water for the fracs coming in, it can be as much as 14 parts water to 1 part crude oil when you take into account everything coming in and going out. And no question about it, right? You're basically selling oil to pay to move water around. And in fact, in high water cut plays like the Permian Basin, especially the Delaware Basin, moving around the salt water that comes up with the oil and getting rid of it can be not just the largest single operating cost of pumping oil out of the ground. It can be a majority of the total production cost for every barrel of oil, especially if you're putting it on trucks. So it is a huge, huge part of the business, and one that really most operators didn't even wake up to until 2015, 2016, during the last crash that wasn't that long ago. It was kind of like, 2009 to 2014, oil prices were so high, it didn't matter that much that somehow your costs doubled during that period. Well, what did they double from? Who cares? They went from 20 to 40. We don't exactly know, but we're selling at 100. Well, when it came back down to 40 and less, then it was like, well, we can't really stay in business if it costs us 40 to sell for 40. How did this go from 15 or 20 to 40? And the answer was basically the introduction of water logistics into the upstream supply chain as the single largest activity of upstream. And no one really noticed until the 2015-16 crash, when companies started to figure out what are our costs? What were we spending our money on for the last 5 years? Let's figure that out.
So it evolved. The company did, right? You started looking at this marketplace type structure, which I find very fascinating. Anytime someone's trying to introduce a marketplace where there may be some inefficiencies, I think that's interesting. But then quickly it seemed like you guys started getting smarter around some of these other aspects and realizing, and I've seen some from some of your other content. I'll put a plug out there. You've done a number of virtual type of things like podcasts with the Wildcatters and things that are out there. So people are interested in that, they can check out some of the previous Wildcatter podcasts. But I've heard you talk about he had another, maybe an aha moment where it was, hey, people are using my software in some ways, not for the things we had potentially designed it for, but for other things. Talk a little bit about that and how it's evolved since you started it.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. So it really has been a big evolution for us, even kind of two evolutions or pivots, as they like to say in startup world. So the whole water marketplace was getting a lot of activity in the Marcellus. And then when we had the whole 15-16 crash, it was hard to say what was going on, And then the market in the Permian, we moved down to Houston in 2016, started building a company here, totally focused on the Permian at that point, because it's the only place anything was going on. And learning the whole market all over again from scratch. And when the market started coming back in 2017, we started seeing a lot of activity on our water marketplace. We're getting thousands of companies signing up, lots of landowners wanted to sell water or disposal. We were getting all these searches, but we weren't getting any transactions. Nobody was buying or selling online. And we realized, we had this business model of getting paid transaction fees, like a real estate broker. And we weren't getting very many of them. And yet people were using the platform like crazy. So we realized, what we've created here is a free market research and intelligence platform for the oil and gas industry. And as much as I love the industry, it's not my charity of choice. So we got to figure out how to turn this from a charity into a business. And, maybe we should just do what everyone else does, which is charge for a ticket for admission, and turn this into a data platform where people pay a SaaS type or data as a service type annual fee for access to it. And in order to do that, we had to make sure that if we were letting people into the party, that they had a good time and wanted to stay and come back. So you couldn't come in and just find two people sitting by a table with one drink in front of them in a quiet room, right? There had to be a lot of data in the data platform. It had to be useful. It had to be worth visiting and coming back. So that led us to creating a much broader data platform that included not only the marketplace price and activity, which is unique, but actually building out all of this intelligence around oil field market data, regulatory data, building systems that would gather all of the oil and gas production and injection and drilling permits, the water production, the water injection, from the groundwater well all the way to the disposal well, including all the oil and gas movements, and building this huge, complex data architecture and data gathering system for everything about what was going on in Texas and New Mexico. And so where that went was we were actually, the twist is that we end up doing something much more extensive than the typical market intelligence platform. Because if you look at the industry out there and the companies that historically provide what's going on where in terms of drilling permits, they're basically all doing the same thing, which is pulling Railroad Commission and other state agency drilling permit information from some database. They're chewing it up to some extent. They're spitting it on a map. They used to send you CD-ROM. Now it comes on the internet, but it's still the same thing. And what we stumbled into was when we were doing the marketplace stuff still, we realized that every frac needs a frac pond. And whoever owns that frac pond, which is a big temporary swimming pool where there's a lot of groundwater that's used for well stimulation, whoever owns that frac pond, they tend to be really excited about the idea that they could sell more water on the internet. Because now they've built the pond, they're filling it, it's literally being wasted, blowing away in the sun. And if there's somebody who can use it and buy it for a short-term need, they love that. So we started to try to figure out how do we find everybody who owns a frac pond, at least in West Texas? And, it turns out it's not that easy. You imagine like the Permian Basin is the size of the 9 smallest U.S. states combined. So, you you wouldn't drive around Rhode Island trying to count every swimming pool in everybody's backyard. And Rhode Island's just one of those 9 smallest states, right?
That's a great way to put
so
it.
how do you see what's going on over this 100,000 square mile area to find every single pond and figure out not just where's the water in the desert, but what kind of water is it? Maybe it really is a swimming pool, right? Maybe it's a golf course. Maybe it's a reservoir. Is it a frac pond? And what we discovered was there is no government regulatory data about where frac ponds are, what's in them, who owns them. Nothing. Turns out it's one of the most important things in the upstream oil and gas supply chain because every frac needs a frac pond built and filled with water before you can frac, always. And there is no information for the regulators or for businesses about where these are and what's happening with them. And so then we stumbled on the idea of, hey, maybe we can see these squares of water in the desert from space. And so this was 2017, and we started working on satellite imagery and building machine learning systems to detect these pits and know what's a frac water pond and what's not a frac water pond. It's some other kind of water.
You ever fly over one of these areas in a plane and look down from the window?
Midland.
Yeah, and you look down and you see all the different well sites, and you look out as far as you can see, and it's just like, I mean, it's powerful from the air. You can really see the extent of how this development plays out. But to your point, you're just getting into is how do you figure out what's a frac pond and what's not?
Totally. And then what we realized was, we're building all these systems and we started getting all these patents because it seems to have not really occurred to anybody before that you could use satellite imagery to see what's going on in the upstream side of the business, as opposed to the downstream. There were a lot of people doing it. And we realized, there's a lot of stuff we can see happening on the ground in addition to frac ponds that's really interesting in this imagery. And either it's stuff that never shows up in regulatory data, like frac ponds, or it's stuff that shows up with such a long lag time by the time it comes out that it's not that useful, or it's a lot less useful than it could be. For example, spuds and completions in frac crews, you don't find out about those typically for about 6 months after it's actually already happened. And so there's all these DUCs, these drilled but uncompleted wells out there that would be the next thing to go, but you don't know if there's a frac crew there. So one of the key things, the next one we worked on after frac ponds was detecting well pad construction as soon as it starts. Because it turns out that, and we did a whole study on this, and there's a white paper available on it. We analyzed over 12,000 Permian Basin spuds, every single spud, in 2018, 2019. And what we looked at was, what is the time relationship and probability relationship between a drilling permit, a well pad, and a spud, a well actually getting started? And what we discovered was, first of all, about 1/3 of the time, the well pad gets built before any drilling permit is filed. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, when the contractor's available or the company's particular policy, you got to build the road, you got to build the pad. You always have to build a road and a pad to drill a well. But the drilling permit you get right before, it costs like $100, $200. Building a well pad costs a couple $100,000. So it turns out not only could we see who was planning, who was getting ready to drill before any other source, like the drilling permits everybody uses, but we actually were also able to see which drilling permits the operators were really serious about drilling, because it turns out that there's a lot of drilling permits that either seem to never get drilled or they don't get drilled for a long time after they get filed. And so you're wasting your time if you're chasing them. But when you see a drilling permit that then has a well pad pop up right under it, now they're serious about moving forward. Something's going to happen in the next 30 days. You need to get to work.
They're moving dirt, they're spending money. The probabilities go up, right? I mean, that doesn't mean someone couldn't build a pad and not do it. But at that point, if you're trying to use it for business intelligence purposes, I mean, sure, like you said, permits, they're not that expensive and they're relatively easy to file. And now you've got this other source of intelligence that is going to give you more of a level of activity than how you mentioned earlier. What are you going to do? Go drive around or go talk? I mean, I guess you could talk to people in Midland. I'm sure that would get you some part of the way, right? But this sounds like
that's our competition.
Yeah, right. This sounds a lot more efficient.
Our competition is the guy talking to the other guy who says, yeah, I already know what I need to know. And you know what? He does. He does know what he needs to know from that guy. The question is, how do you get to be everybody else's second call when you're the first call for the one or two or maybe three guys who you're the first call? Okay, but what about the other 1,000? How do you get to be their second call? And that's from the business development side. That's what this type of market intelligence really helps with.
Yeah. So the different users of this, who are kind of the target, audiences, and I guess it's changed a little bit as you guys have changed. But talk a little bit about the use cases, and then maybe some of the ways that these guys look at return on investment or the value that this brings.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's one that I hate to say something's complicated before starting because I want to get anybody cross-eyed, but there are a lot of scenarios because what we do is a big data platform that does a lot of stuff for a lot of different people in a lot of different cases. And so, there's a lot of different stories to tell. The kind of the big, easy story to tell is we're known for water intelligence. We do all the oil and gas intelligence that you get from other companies, all the drilling permits and the production and land ownership and all this kind of stuff. But what we're unique with and what we're really known for is doing the water intelligence, right? So throughout the Permian Basin, we show for every producing lease how much produced water it's producing every month and where that water is going for disposal. And for every commercial disposal, where all of their water is coming from and how much and how busy they are and how much capacity they have and that sort of thing. So we actually generate these things we call spider charts that show these cool lines that basically are showing how much water is going from every single producing lease to every single disposing lease every month between any given set of operators or any area. And we do some interesting stuff with combining all that to show basically the exact shifting magnitudes of every business relationship between every producing company and every disposing company. So we call those water flow charts. So what's all that about? Well, the biggest use case is there's like a $40 billion industry out there. Okay, it's less than that now compared to that was 2 years ago. But there was a $40 billion industry out there, and it's coming back. It's coming back quick.
$100 oil.
It is coming back quick.
Soon.
It is coming back quick. I'm very happy to say. 2021's looking, it's picking up. So there's a big industry out there that is providing equipment and services that relate to doing everything you could possibly think of with water, especially produced water. Big business. And if you're in any of those businesses selling logistics, pipelines, disposal services, chemicals, treatment, aeration, liners, you name it, you need to know who's got water where, who's producing water where, what are they doing with it now, and is there an opportunity here for me to sell them my stuff or save them money versus what they're doing now. That is the basic fundamental kind of business development use case where someone will sign up for what we're doing on a first or second phone call when they hear about it.
You say you can predict the water flows. And so I'm wondering, can you translate that into the flows of the actual product? So can you extrapolate into thinking about, hey, how much oils are going to be, how much gases are going to be? Could, like, for example, traders that trade on these, this information where they were trying to predict what inventories are going to be, and they look at activities from areas like the Permian, for example, whenever we had this freeze, how much, came offline. You could maybe extrapolate that out to other basins and try to come up with not just water flows, but maybe supply flows of these products. I mean, it just seems, I don't know if you've done any of that, but as my gears are turning, I'm thinking of what are all the different implications of this technology that you've developed, and how could that be used in other ways that are interplay with what you're already doing?
Yeah, I mean, we actually have a patent on that, believe it or not, for predicting oil, gas, and water production using machine learning from oil and gas wells. But there is so much to, it's kind of an endless, and the stuff I love is the creative solutions, putting things together in new and different ways. That's what I get excited about. But there is so much to do in terms of the data science around predicting the water supply and demand, in addition to the oil and gas production, where that's going. It's just endless. And that really gets to one of the other big use cases for our system, and one that's more sophisticated, but also higher value, right? Because the easy, obvious case is I sell something that relates to water. I need to know who's got it and where they're sending it now and where I can go and not waste my time and have a good opportunity. But the second big use case is there's an entire industry that has grown up in the last 5 years called water midstream. And this was not a thing 5 years ago. It was barely a thing 3 years ago. And so what's happened is there's this whole asset class of buying and building water pipeline recycling and disposal systems to move water all around the Permian Basin and to a lesser extent some other places. And, if you think about it, how do you know where you should build a commercial water pipeline or a non-commercial water pipeline, or where you should put a disposal well that's going to take one of the things that's kind of crazy about the water business and the water disposal business is it's actually fundamentally much harder than the crude oil business. Now, why do I say that? Because if you drill an oil well and it actually produces oil, it's a, pretty darn good bet that you can sell that oil to somebody at some price. That's not really in doubt. What price you're going to get? Yeah, maybe, is it negative $40 or whatever it was? Okay. But pretty much, every other day of the year, you can sell crude oil at some price. If you invest that exact same amount of money, $5 to $10 million building a saltwater disposal well, same cost as a nice, long horizontal oil well, and you put it in the wrong spot, and there's not basically an excess of produced water coming out of the ground near that spot that's not already committed going somewhere else, and there's not already too much capacity for putting that water away, you just build a $10 million hole in the ground that nobody wants. So figuring out where to put disposal wells and water treatment facilities and water pipeline infrastructure is a much tougher business problem than figuring out where to put oil wells, because there's this major geospatial element. And it does include how deep to drill them and which formations go in and which ones are risky and which ones are solid and which ones have capacity and which ones are overpressure. We model all that 3D stuff in the subsurface where the water's really going, how they perform. But just figuring out which spot on the map to put that next disposal, or whether buying one is a good idea or a bad idea based on the operator activity and the water activity and the predictions all around that, that is a super complicated problem. And so figuring out, should I buy or build something and where should it go in terms of that water capacity? That is a major market that we serve both for these water midstream companies and for the operators, because actually the biggest owners and operators of water infrastructure are still the oil and gas companies themselves, who handle a majority of their water still. So that's a huge, huge application. And then we get to the other operator applications, which maybe we'll talk about. But that whole water midstream space and assessing and predicting the supply and demand balance of produced water versus disposal and treatment capacity in any given geospatial area on the map, that super complicated problem, that is the big focus of the data science and development that we do.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm thinking just as you're talking about all this stuff, I'm thinking about the different applications that could potentially be out there. One thing that might be interesting is compression, because that is something that is very much, you can see it, right? You can see how big the units are. You can see where they're placed. Compression correlates pretty good to gas flows, right? Because you can tell, okay, well, there's this size of a compressor unit, which means it's probably, if it was full, it'd be using this much gas. Maybe another thing could be like power lines, right? Like where's the power at? You see substations here. These guys just laid a new line to this area. How much power do we think is over there? Or is there going to need to be more? Maybe there's companies out there. I don't know. I'm just trying to think. There's probably all kinds of things you can learn from this data just by looking at what's going on.
There is so much to do. And the same kind of methods and patents that we've used for detecting the well pads and the frac crews is something, and the frac ponds, is something we're applying to lots of these features like compressors and like lease roads.
Yeah, lease roads.
And being able to navigate those. And rights of way, there's a lot to do. One of the things that's interesting, power lines, we do map the power lines now. And the reason is pumping water around is the single largest consumption of electricity in the oil field. Running the pumps that move the water through the water pipelines and into the disposals is the biggest consumer of electricity. And it's the biggest cost of operations if you operate a disposal well. So you really want to make sure that you've got access to grid power well, last week, actually, you might have been better off with diesel power.
With diesel.
But usually, you're better off with grid power. Usually, it costs about 1/10 of what diesel power costs, usually. Not 10,000 times as much. But you want to know where that is, because that makes a big, big impact on the economics of, does it make sense to build a water disposal or treatment facility or pipeline this location? You need to know what kind of power you can get.
Yeah. That's all great stuff. And we could probably, talk the whole time about those different ideas. But one thing, we're getting a little close on time. And I wanted to ask around, when you're in Midland, Texas, and you say things like artificial intelligence, or you talk about these technologies that you guys have come up with, is it culturally, sometimes I feel like in oil and gas, it may be tough to adopt new things whenever guys are used to doing something, like you said, the way they've always done it. What do you run into that at all whenever you start to throw out some of this stuff that's definitely more advanced on the tech side? And if so, how do you get over some of those barriers? I think that would be a good segment to end it on.
Yeah, that's definitely true, Max. And it's changing. It's changing for sure. I mean, I've been at this for 7 years now, and definitely attitudes have been shifting about it. I mean, I think on the business development side, the classic response is, I know people around here, and I'm sure what you're doing is helpful for people who don't know people around here. But for me, I know where my bread gets buttered, and I'm going back there. And look, that's true, right? If you are not trying to grow your business, and if you're not new to the area, and if you're not doing any new development. But if you are doing new development or trying to grow the business, or you're new to the area or expanding to do a new lease, it matters a lot to have that kind of external intelligence to know what's going on with who and where the best opportunities to move into. And even for the people who have well-established relationships where they get the bulk of their business from, they still need to make sure that they're everybody else's second call. They got the couple of first calls, but you can't always rely on those companies staying in business. And on the operator side, it's a bit of a more complicated question, because the reason is that with respect to water, the whole thing is so new that there's very little consistency about how responsibilities related to water are managed or measured, or even really any awareness of it at different operators of different sizes with different practices. So what I mean is, one company might have a water management department that's deciding where water comes from and goes to, and what kind of facilities they're going to build or what kind of treatments to use. Another company might not have a water management department, and there's a production group that's deciding where the produced water from the producing wells go, but maybe there's a completion manager, a completion engineer, who's deciding where the flow back from the newly fracked wells goes and where they're going to get the water from. Maybe there's a land team that's deciding where they're going to get the water from and send it to. And what about designing the disposal wells, or even design the oil and gas wells? How do you predict how much water is going to come out of those, and what kind of data do you have around that? Or are you just taking a wild ass guess, and hopefully you got enough capacity, and a lot of times it turns out you don't. So it's a whole new field of study and a whole new field of business that has so much complexity to it. I would say by far, from a business standpoint, that's been our biggest challenge. Is not with the business development people on the service side, because they get it pretty darn quick. You show them a couple of screens and they're like, "Hey, sign me up." And if it don't work for me, I won't renew it next year. But I can see how if I get one deal out of this, it was worth it.
Yeah,
and it's really
on one deal, like you just mentioned. I mean, look, if as a business development person, if you can have a tool, the thing with BD is that the stakes are high, right? It only takes a little bit. One deal can be enormous for these guys. So yeah, I would imagine that's right. It's pretty high ROI.
Look, on the business development on the oil field services side, it is truly a no-brainer, and it's an easy sale. We show them what we're doing, they see the value. It's really not hard at all, because what we're doing is very new, and there's an obvious value proposition. And it's, hey, if I get one more deal, it paid for itself, no question. Now, 2020 was a different story, because nobody was spending money on anything, and it was all about cutting and freezing. And hey, we don't need to know market intelligence when we know there just is no market. So come back next year, right? Unfortunately. But hey, things are coming back. On the operator side, though, on the E&P side, it's a very different situation, because water is such a huge and complicated part of the upstream supply chain, and everything that's going on with it, from well design and engineering to logistics to regulatory to IT. Companies are worried about earthquakes. I mean, you're getting into EHS and ESG type of stuff. It's everywhere. It's everything. I mean, more than 90% of all of the fluid and material being moved around by upstream companies is water, right? So of course it's huge and complicated. It touches everything. And that's all new in the last 10 years. And so our challenge is for the companies that really get the most value out of our system and that are by far our biggest contracts when you look at some of the top few shale operators in Texas. Every single time there's this very extensive educational process, which is, wow, there's so many different people we have to talk to and they got to change the way they're doing things. They got to trust the results we're giving them. And, we got to build and customize these tools for their particular way of doing things. And so it's a very long process that can definitely be challenging. We've had some great outcomes on it, but it does require some patience, especially after a year like last year. We're hopeful that a lot of these companies, especially on the E&P side, are going to start to see the value of having kind of comprehensive four-dimensional water data as part of their oil field data array, including kind of from the subsurface modeling to the supply chain optimization and everything in between. But that's really been that's been the biggest challenge.
Yeah, that's great stuff. No, I mean, this is one of those things where it's really always interesting to me to see how technology can tackle some of these problems. And you look at, the way that people are doing things and how can we challenge the status quo. And what you guys are doing is really exciting. And I'm excited that I got to do this segment because I feel like I learned something today and hopefully the audience did as well. But Josh, I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming to the conference and best of luck. Looking forward to seeing what you guys do into the future. Thanks
a lot, Max. I really appreciate it. And Digital Wildcatters, Jade, Colin, thanks a lot for inviting us to have us on.
Yeah, absolutely.